Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics and the wider Horn of Africa region. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. On this week's program, speaking to Somalis in the US state of Minnesota during his visit to participate in the US Africa Summit, President Hassan Sheikh announced that Somali soldiers training in Eritrea will finally return home from this month, with all soldiers set to be back on home soil by the end of January 2023. What does this mean for the current war against Al-Shabab, and is Somalia finally on the brink of turning the tide against Somali militants following 15 years of grueling conflict? This is the topic on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you are currently watching this program, and where you can find other exclusive programs such as Mahahi Salah and the African Weekly Roundup, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Sulman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into it. Finally, after over a year of fake news reports by outlets and discredited UN report which obtained its evidence from questionable sources, the incumbent President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud announced on Monday that Somali National Army units training in Eritrea will be returning home from this month in an operation that is expected to last until the end of January. For months, rumors have swirled in Somalia that soldiers may have been deployed to the war-torn Ethiopian region of Tigray. It was in July of this year, in a statement that surprised many, Villa Somalia announced that President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud planned to travel to Eritrea on an official 4-day visit in which he would meet the Somali National Army soldiers that were training in that country. Millions of Somalis, including the president himself, saw 5,000 strong Somali units greeting him and the Eritrean President Afwerki as they paraded before the president gave a speech. Now, upon his return, Villa Somalia spokesman Abdikarim Khan announced that all rumors regarding the deployment and deaths of SNA soldiers in Tigray, previously advocated himself, the President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, as an opposition leader, among others, was entirely a fabricated false rumor. Now, for over a year, many Somali politicians that were opposed to the former government led by President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, including the incumbent current president himself, argued that Somali units stationed in Eritrea took part in the conflict in the neighboring Tigray region of Ethiopia. From major presidential candidates to political analysts and journalists to so-called independent think tanks, all agreed that there must have been Somali soldiers that fought in the Tigray war because the Tigray leadership argued so. In hindsight, what we can see is a sophisticated and coordinated disinformation campaign by a handful of interconnected individuals from various professions that had a vested interest in Somalia. It is such individuals that planted the seed that would eventually form to be one of the biggest fake news scandals that hit the Somali government in over a decade. Now, before we actually assess the most recent updates regarding SNA troops stationed in Eritrea, let's take a trip down memory lane to see exactly who and when this seed of disinformation was planted into the Somali political arena and by who. Now, many supporters of the argument that Somali troops died and fought in Tigray cite the UN Human Rights Council, more specifically the report released by Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, Mohammed Abdulsalam Babikar. Halfway down page 6 of the report following is written, and I'm quoting, "The Special Rapporteur also received information reports that Somali soldiers were moved from military training camps in Eritrea to the front line in Tigray, where they were accompanied by Eritrean troops as they crossed the Ethiopian border. It is also reported that Somali fighters were present around Aksum. The government of Somalia denied the participation of Somali soldiers in the Tigray conflict," and that's the end quote in the report. You can find this written in page 6 of the report. Now, of course, such a statement is bold, as there is no actual evidence produced by Mr. Babikar other than he had received information that Somali soldiers were fighting in Tigray. So the question becomes, where did the Special Rapporteur obtain such information? If we actually look at the citation for the paragraph, we see the exact source of the information comes from a controversial and unsubstantiated article written by Amanda Spieber for the South African newspaper The Mail and Guardian, titled "Somali Soldiers May Have Been Drawn into Ethiopia's Civil War," dated 20th of January 2021. Now, in the article, it argues that Somali soldiers accompanied Eritrean troops to fight in Tigray, leaving their designated army barracks. It cites the controversial newspaper Gerewa Online as being the direct source of information to back such a statement. Now, Gerewa Online itself previously interviewed former NISA Deputy Chief Abdulsalam Guled. Mr. Guled previously served as Deputy Director of the Somali National Intelligence Security Agency between 2013 and 2017 under the first-term presidency of President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. Now, Guled told Geruwa Online that Somali soldiers left their barracks and joined the war against TPLF militia in Tigray. However, what is interesting is that within the same article written by Ms. Bieber, she warns that the Geruwa Online article could not verify the accusations made by Abdulsalam Guled. In fact, when Ms. Bieber interviewed Guled on behalf of the Mail and Guardian newspaper, Mr. Guled stated that his sources of information was an unnamed Ethiopian official and an anonymous civilian woman that claimed that she saw Somali soldiers fighting around the ancient town of Aksum. Now, of course, such sources lack any credibility and validity, especially claims of such a large magnitude. For instance, we can debunk this entire statement because, for instance, if we refer to the Ethiopian Defense Forces, it has Somalis within its ranks. Additionally, the Somali Regional State Forces also deployed state troops to fight against TPLF in Tigray. Therefore, a situation where the witnesses were credible, it's easily arguable that those Somalis that she could have seen, this unnamed woman witness in Aksum, could easily have been Somalis fighting within the Ethiopian Defense Forces or the Somali region itself. Now, before we leave this topic of the fake news dispute, I want to address two more points regarding this very topic. Number one, many question why the previous administration led by Farmajo refused to disclose the amount, location and return of these soldiers. In actuality, militaries across the world deploy soldiers for training or combat missions in secrecy. Take, for example, the United States of America. US troops cannot inform even their family members about locations and missions, yet many analysts and journalists convey the picture in Somalia that the government must be evil if it is not conveying with the public sensitive state information that could be detrimental to national security. Now, this is not about supporting Farmajo or supporting Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. This is about the correct procedural framework needed of the government, particularly on matters concerning national security. The government shouldn't be providing sensitive, detailed information on our military or our national security to journalists who are questioning what the government's doing. The journalists have every right to question the government, and rightly so. That's their job. But it isn't their job to seek state secrets and then demand this information. If it's not given, then argue that the government must be doing something evil. And the second point is, many raised the question, if training was finished for all 5,000 soldiers in 2021, why weren't units returned back to Somalia immediately? Well, the Farmajo administration said that they decided to delay their return to avoid disrupting parliamentary and presidential elections. Now, if we put politics to the side for 1 minute and we recall events that unfolded in Somalia in 2021, we understand exactly why this was done. Indeed, we recall all the reckless attempts by opposition politicians to divide SNA army by calling for mutiny, and eventually this led to the formation of the Badbadaqar militia. Now, whether you support Farmajo, you don't support him, whether you support Hassan Sheikh, if you don't support him, the idea of mutiny by the military, the idea of the military's ranks and soldiers saying, hey, we don't recognize the government anymore and we're now going to form a militia to fight its own army in its own government positions in the capital, is absurd, and it wouldn't happen in any civilized country. It wouldn't happen in any democratic country. And it shouldn't be happening in Somalia, of all places. Now, in hindsight, the redeployment of 5,000 soldiers could have been used as ammunition to further cite the alleged accusation of militaries or political purposes, which obviously Farmajo and his government vehemently denied. So now let's address who these soldiers are and how it will impact the current changing political and security dynamic in Somalia. Now, in a brief nutshell, these Somali cadets were sent to Eritrea in different times between 2019 and 2020. We don't know the exact details. They have been trained at 4 camps, allegedly in the vicinity of Gergera Dam, within the mountains of the Dubub region in Eritrea. According to some sources, this has not been confirmed. And cadets obviously received high training to a high standard from hardened veterans of the Eritrea Defense Forces. Various units were trained, ranging from pilots for the UN-sanctioned Somali Air Force to Somali new Navy men, all the way to ground forces. Now, indeed, with the current conflict seeing tangible results in both Hirshabelle and Galmudug in central Somalia, the return of freshly trained 5,000 strong units will most definitely change the tide on the conflict on the ground. The Somali army has been heavily relying on local clan militia known as Ma'awisley to support the push against Al-Shabab in the central regions. However, there are other major obstacles forming that could, if not significantly, completely derail the entire operation against Al-Shabab. Firstly, we must look at events unfolding in southwest state Somalia. Now, if many of you are not aware, the electoral mandate of the state presidency was extended by the parliamentary chamber the state-shaped parliament in Baydhabo last year. Now, the terms of the presidency and the government in the state were only a 4-year term, whereas parliament was 5. Of course, if we logically assess this, it doesn't make any sense because elections in Southwest states, much like the rest of Somalia, is indirect, and the president is elected by parliament. So it would not make any reasonable sense to have the same very parliament elect a new president when there's obviously going to be vested interests in those parliamentarians on who they vote for. The ending of the term for all branches of government at the same time, like all other democracies in the globe, seems most tangible and most reasonable. Nevertheless, the opposition groups, including some federal government ministers that have been brewingly plotting and creating an idea to overthrow the Laftagoran state government since May of this year, announced the formation of Southwest States Salvation Force, a militia similar to the one seen in Mogadishu last year, which is based on tribal lines, which is currently threatening violence if their demands are not met. Similarly, in Gedo, we begin to see instability continue to grow, and tensions between the regional capital of Jubaland, Kismayo, its region Gedo, and Mogadishu, the capital, is continuing to grow. Now, it's great to see 5,000 soldiers return to support the opening of new fronts in Jubaland and Southwest State. However, militants thrive under certain conditions that we're seeing currently in Southwest State and Gedo. These are political instability, divided communities, infighting and civil war of some sort, and finally political grievances. And events unfolding in Southwest State and in Gedo are prime examples of this. An unstable Southwest State or unstable Jubaland will enable fleeing Al-Shabab militants to find new safe havens and breeding grounds for a new generation of militants to continue fighting their wars against the Somali people as they have done for the last 15 years. We already know Al-Shabab control the Middle Juba region entirely in Jubaland. We cannot allow Al-Shabab to leak into Gedo again, to begin to take over more regions in Bakol and further expand into Southwest State because they're fleeing central Somalia. We must take every step to ensure a peaceful outcome of disputes in Jubaland, as well as ensuring only dialogue between disagreeing parties in Southwest State, with the focus remaining the war against Al-Shabab. However, how can that be expected of this government when the very government that was supposed to be mediating issues between rival political factions within federal member states are actually instigating and adding fuel to the fire, with federal ministers actively involved in disputes in the region? I asked Hamza Abdul Barre, the Prime Minister, and the President, Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, to actively get involved in dealing with these ministers and ensuring that no conflict is created in Baydhabo. Baydhabo is the bedrock of Somalia, it's the center of Somalia, it's the backbone of the current government and the current federal system that exists. An unstable Southwest State is going to be havoc for the Somali government.